The lab report burned in my hands. My best friend's DNA matched my son's, not mine. The hospital walls closed in as Dr. Thorne's words echoed, "This isn't possible." Then the masked man lunged in the parking garage, his gloved fingers ripping at my medical file. I swung the flashlight, once, twice, until he fled into the rain. Now my husband's phone buzzes with calls he won't answer, and the adoption papers we trusted for 9 years. They never existed. The fluorescent hum of the hospital corridor vibrated against Sarah Jenkins's temples, a relentless, electric buzzing that seemed to pulse in time with the throbbing behind her eyes. She stood at the scrub sink, the scent of antiseptic soap, sharp, medicinal, and biting, filling her nostrils. The water ran hot over her knuckles, steam rising to fog her glasses, but she didn't push them up. She simply watched the suds swirl down the drain, a small whirlpool of chemical foam. She was minutes away from a final surgical consult, the culmination of months of preparation to give a piece of herself, literally, to her best friend, Chloe Miller. The heavy swing door of the scrub room creaked on its hinges. Sarah didn't turn, but she caught the reflection in the polished chrome of the towel dispenser. Dr. Aris Thorne stood there, his silhouette sharp against the sterile white tile. He didn't offer the usual pre-op nod. Instead, he stood with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a lab coat, so white it hurt to look at. "Sarah," he said. His voice carried the flat resonance of a man reading a weather report, devoid of its usual collegial warmth. "I'm nearly ready, Aris," Sarah replied, her voice dry. She reached for the paper towels, the rough fibers scraping against her damp skin. "The donor prep is scheduled for 0800. I've logged the pre-op checklist. Everything is within parameters." Thorne stepped closer. The heat from his body radiated a faint, medicinal musk, mixing with the scent of floor wax that always seemed to cling to the hallway. He held a manila folder in his hand, the edges slightly curled. He didn't hand it to her. He laid it on the edge of the sink, where a stray drop of water immediately began to bloom into a dark circle on the paper. "The lab just finished the final cross-match for the Miller transplant," Thorne whispered. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "We ran the extended genetic markers to ensure the highest chance of organ reception. We also ran the samples you provided for the family history baseline, the ones from Leo." Sarah felt a sudden, sharp chill despite the steam in the room. "And? The compatibility should be high. I've seen the preliminary data." "The data changed, Sarah," Thorne said, his jaw working with rhythmic precision. He flicked the folder open. "The DNA cross-matching for the transplant shows a biological impossibility for a random donor-recipient pair. Leo isn't just a match for Chloe's general profile. He shares a specific maternal genetic signature with her. Sarah, the boy you've raised for 8 years, he is biologically related to the woman on your operating table." The world seemed to tilt. The buzzing of the lights intensified, turning into a roar in Sarah's ears. She gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, the cold stone biting into her palms. Maternal genetic signature. The words didn't make sense. She had the adoption papers. She had the memories of the nursery, the smells of baby powder and new blankets. She looked at the charts, her eyes scanning the sequences of letters and numbers that defined a life. It was a lock and a key, and the key to Leo's blood didn't belong to her. It belonged to Chloe. "There's an error," Sarah whispered, her breath hitching. "Entry 4114. "I am sorry, Aris, but the lab has made a clerical error. I will log the discrepancy. We need a retest." "There is no error." Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, somber vibration. "We ran it 3 times. The markers are irrefutable. Chloe Miller is not just your friend, Sarah. She is the mother of your son." The air in the hospital parking garage was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. A low, gray mist rolled in from the Seattle waterfront, clinging to the pillars like a shroud. Sarah walked toward her SUV, her footsteps echoing, a hollow, rhythmic clicking that sounded like a countdown. In her hand, she gripped the manila folder, the paper damp from the humidity. Her mind was a chaotic storm of variables. Mark, the adoption, the agency in San Francisco. None of the math added up. As she reached space 4B, the overhead fluorescent light flickered, pulsing every 3 seconds. The rhythmic flash cast long, jerky shadows across the hood of her car. She reached for her keys, her fingers trembling so violently they clattered against the metal door handle. A shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar behind her. It happened in a blur of motion. A figure, clad in a dark hoodie that obscured their face, lunged forward. A hand, rough and smelling of stale tobacco, clamped over her mouth. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The assailant didn't go for her purse. They didn't go for her jewelry. A gloved hand snatched at the folder tucked under her arm. "Give it here," a gravelly voice hissed. The instinct that governed Sarah in the operating room, the cold, calculated response to a crisis, kicked in. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She remembered the heavy, industrial-grade flashlight sitting in the side pocket of her driver's side door. With a grunt of effort, she threw her weight backward, slamming the attacker against the side of the SUV. The metal groaned under the impact. She wrenched her arm free and dove for the door. Her fingers found the cold, textured grip of the flashlight. It was a heavy piece of steel, meant for emergencies on dark highways. She swung it in a wide, desperate arc. The heavy end of the light connected with the attacker's shoulder with a sickening thud. The man cried out, a sharp yelp of pain that echoed through the empty garage. He stumbled back, his boots skidding on the oil-slicked floor. Sarah didn't wait. She swung again, the light cutting through the misty air, catching the assailant across the forearm. The man hissed, clutching his arm. He looked at her, or rather, at the folder she held pinned against her chest. For a second, they stood locked in a silent battle of wills under the flickering light. Then, hearing the distant sound of a security gate whining open, the attacker turned and vanished into the labyrinth of concrete pillars, his footsteps fading into the Seattle drizzle. Sarah slumped against the car, the flashlight slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the asphalt. Her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. She looked down at the folder. It was wrinkled, stained with a smudge of grease from the attacker's glove. But it was hers. She had kept the truth. But as she looked into the darkness where the man had disappeared, she realized the physical bruises were only the beginning. The garage felt smaller now, the shadows longer, and the city she called home felt like a cage. The drive home was a blur of wipers swiping against a relentless mist and the rhythmic thumping of Sarah's heart. She pulled into the driveway of the Jenkins estate, a house that was a masterpiece of false comfort. The autumn spice potpourri hit her the moment she opened the front door, an aggressive, artificial scent that tried and failed to mask the cold silence of the foyer. Mark was in the kitchen, pouring a glass of amber liquid. He looked like the picture of success, a granite jawline, a crisp button-down shirt, and that unblinking, heavy eye contact that usually made Sarah feel safe. But as she walked in, he didn't move to hug her. He stayed behind the marble island, his fingers moving in a specific rhythmic sequence. Thumb, index, pinky, middle. Pop, 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 pop. The sound made Sarah's skin crawl. It was the sound of a looming lie. "You're late, Sarah," Mark said. His voice was a low, structural rumble. "The foundation of the evening is already shifting. Leo's been asking for you." Sarah laid the folder on the counter. The damp paper looked like an open wound on the pristine white stone. "The transplant results came back, Mark. Dr. Thorne ran the genetic markers." Mark's hand froze mid-crack. He didn't look at the folder. He looked at Sarah, his eyes tracking the slight tremor in her hands, the bruise beginning to bloom on her cheek from the struggle in the garage. "And? I assume the compatibility is a solid blueprint for the surgery." "The blueprint is a lie, Mark," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "Leo is biologically related to Chloe. How is that possible? We went through the agency. We had the background checks. We had the legal filings." Mark took a slow sip of his drink. He didn't act surprised. He didn't gasp or express confusion. Instead, he leaned in, his posture becoming rigid, defensive. "You're overthinking the infrastructure again, Sarah. Labs make mistakes. Variables shift. We've built a life here. Don't be the crack in the drywall that brings the whole ceiling down on our son." "Don't use those metaphors with me," Sarah shouted, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "I was attacked in the garage, Mark. Someone tried to steal these results. Why would someone want to hide Leo's DNA?" Mark's face didn't soften. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply adjusted his sleeves, his eyes cold. "Maybe you're just stressed. Maybe you imagined the intent. Go upstairs, Sarah. Clean yourself up. I've handled the structural integrity of this family for 10 years. Trust the design." Sarah backed away, her heels clicking on the hardwood. She saw him then, not as the anchor of her life, but as a stranger who had built a house out of secrets. She realized that the man she slept next to wasn't just hiding a secret. He was the architect of it. Subverted beat 1.4, Sarah retreated to the small, cramped space of her home office, the only room in the house that didn't smell of autumn spice. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over a contact she hadn't called in years. Christopher Taylor. He was a private investigator who lived in the walls-up world of cold facts and old paper. If anyone could find the hole in the story, it was him. "I need a verification on a business," Sarah told him, her voice a frantic whisper. "The Sunrise Adoption Agency, San Francisco, 2015. "Give me an hour," Taylor replied, the scratch of his pen audible over the line. Sarah waited, counting the seconds. She felt a surge of hope. Taylor was a professional. He had found the truth for hundreds of people. He would find the records, show her that there was a simple explanation, a clerical mix-up, a shared ancestor she didn't know about. She reasoned that a legal agency would have a paper trail a mile long. She just needed the right person to pull the thread. This was the smart move. She was using data to fight the darkness. An hour later, her phone buzzed. She met Taylor at a small, nondescript diner on the edge of the city. The smell of grease and stale coffee was a relief compared to the hospital bleach. Taylor sat in the back booth, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He slid a thin piece of paper across the table. "You were right to look, Sarah," Taylor said. He offered a tired, small smile. "I checked the state registry, the tax filings, the physical address in San Francisco. It took some digging, but I found the incorporation documents." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her shoulders dropped, and she took her first full breath in hours. "So, they're real? There's a record?" Oh, there's a record, Taylor said, his voice dropping. He tapped the paper. But look at the signatures, Sarah. Look at the date of dissolution. Sarah frowned. She pulled the paper closer, her eyes scanning the fine print. She saw the name of the agency. She saw the address. But then her heart stopped. The agency hadn't been dissolved after she adopted Leo. It had been dissolved 3 years before Leo was born. The incorporation documents weren't filed by a legal firm. They were filed by a shell company owned by a holding group. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. The agency was a ghost, Sarah, Taylor said, the warmth vanishing from his face. It was a theatrical production. Someone rented an office, printed some letterhead, and hired a few actors to play social workers. There are no legal records of Leo's adoption because the adoption never happened. There is no state filing, no court order, no birth certificate change in the master registry. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow to the stomach. The world tilted, the diner lights blurring into streaks of yellow. She wasn't just a mother with a complicated history. She was a woman who had been handed a child in a criminal setup. If there's no adoption, Sarah's voice was a ghost of itself, then you have no legal right to that boy, Taylor said, his voice hard as flint. In the eyes of the law, you're a stranger who has been keeping a child for 9 years. And if the biological mother, this Chloe woman, decides to walk into a police station, you won't just lose him, Sarah. You'll be looking at kidnapping charges. Sarah looked down at her hands. The smart move hadn't saved her. It had stripped away the only thing she had left, her name as a mother. She was in a worse position than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just a victim of a lie. She was a fugitive in her own home. The news from the hospital came like a secondary explosion. Sarah was still sitting in the diner, the cold coffee in front of her looking like oil, when her phone shrieked. It was Dr. Thorne. "Chloe's crashed," he said, the sound of a heart monitor's rapid beep, beep, beep audible in the background. "Her kidneys have stopped responding to the dialysis entirely. We can't wait the 48 hours, Sarah. We have to move the surgery up. We're going in tonight. 6 hours." Sarah felt the walls of the booth closing in. "Iris, I can't. I'm not ready. There are things I need to find out." "There is no time for variables, Sarah," Thorne snapped. "The patient is dying. If you don't show up, she's gone. And if she goes, the chance for a match goes with her." Sarah hung up, her mind racing. 6 hours. She had 6 hours to find out why her husband had bought a child from his mistress and then staged a decade-long play to keep her in the dark. She drove back to the house, the rain now a torrential downpour that turned the streets into rivers of black glass. She entered the house through the garage, avoiding the front door. She went straight to her home office, needing to find the original files she had kept, the proof of her motherhood. But when she opened the door, she stopped. The room smelled of scorched dust. Her desk, usually organized with surgical precision, had been ransacked. Papers were strewn across the floor like fallen leaves. Her laptop, the one containing her ledger of guilt, her spreadsheets, her digital life, was gone. The power cord lay on the floor, its tattered end looking like a severed nerve. She ran to the garden door, finding it swinging wide open, the cold wind whipping the curtains into a frenzy. There, on the mud-slicked patio, lay Leo's favorite stuffed bear. It had been shredded, the white stuffing scattered across the grass like snow. "Leo?" she screamed, her voice lost in the wind. She found him in his room, huddled in the corner of his bed, counting. 12, 13, 14. "Leo, baby, what happened?" Sarah knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his shoulder. "The man in the black car," Leo whispered, his eyes wide and vacant. "He came to the door. He said he was looking for the papers. He broke your computer, Mommy. He said if I didn't stay quiet, he'd take the bear away. But he took it anyway." Sarah pulled him into her arms, the scent of his shampoo, green apples, and innocence breaking her heart. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted, and the hunter was already inside the house. Sarah knew she couldn't stay. She packed a small bag for Leo and ushered him into the car, her eyes scanning the dark perimeter of the yard. She needed to see Chloe. She needed to look into the eyes of the woman who had sold her own flesh and blood and then pretended to be a friend for 10 years. She sped toward the Seattle Transplant Center, the city lights blurred by the sheets of rain. The road was a narrow strip of asphalt carved through the dense Douglas firs. In her rearview mirror, 2 pinpricks of light appeared. A black SUV. It approached with terrifying speed. Sarah floored the accelerator, her sedan fishtailing on the slick road. The SUV didn't pass. It lunged forward, the heavy steel bumper slamming into Sarah's rear fender. The sound was a deafening crunch of metal on metal that vibrated through Sarah's teeth. "Mommy!" Leo shrieked from the back seat. "Hold on, Leo, hold on." The SUV hit her again, harder this time, aiming to pit maneuver her into the trees. Sarah fought the wheel, her muscles screaming with the effort. She saw a break in the trees, a construction site where a deep trench had been dug for a new water main. It was a jagged, raw wound in the earth, filled with yellow clay and jagged rocks. The SUV swerved for a final, lethal blow. Sarah had a split second. If she stayed on the road, they were dead. She yanked the wheel to the right, steering the sedan directly into the construction ditch. The car launched into the air for a heartbeat of terrifying weightlessness, then slammed into the mud. The airbags deployed with a muffled bang, filling the cabin with white dust and the smell of gunpowder. The SUV roared past, its engine a predatory growl that faded into the distance. Sarah coughed, her chest tight. "Leo! Leo! Answer me! I'm here." A small, shaky voice came from the back. 14. 14. 14. Sarah kicked the door open, the hinges screaming. She pulled Leo out of the wreckage, both of them covered in yellow mud. The car was totaled, a heap of twisted metal in a hole. She looked up at the road. No one was coming to help. She grabbed Leo's hand and began to run toward the distant glow of the city, the rain washing the mud from her face, but doing nothing to cool the fire in her heart. They reached the hospital by hitching a ride with a delivery truck. Sarah's medical badge, the only thing that convinced the driver she wasn't a vagrant. She left Leo in the care of Robert Wilson, the head of security who stood like a stone wall outside the pediatric ward. "Don't let anyone near him, Robert," Sarah said, her voice raw. Not even Mark. Wilson gave her a single, sharp nod. "I've got the perimeter, Doc. No one gets through." Sarah headed for the transplant ward. As she passed the nurse's station, she saw a courier dropping off a thick, private envelope addressed to Chloe Miller. The nurse was distracted by a ringing phone. Sarah didn't hesitate. She snatched the envelope and slipped into a nearby restroom. Inside, she found stacks of bank statements. They weren't from a standard account. They were from a private offshore fund, detailing monthly stipends of $5,000, paid out for nearly a decade. The sender was MJ Holdings, one of Mark's secret business accounts. The math was finally complete. Mark hadn't just been a provider. He had been a warden. He had been paying Chloe to stay away, to keep the product he had bought for his wife. She stormed into Chloe's room. The woman looked frail, her skin ashen. the dark circles under her eyes looking like bruises. The martyr's hum was a low, vibrating dirge in the quiet room. "You sold him," Sarah whispered, standing at the foot of the bed. Chloe's eyes fluttered open. She didn't look surprised. She looked tired. "He was going to be a king with you, Sarah. Look at this room. Look at your life. What could I have given him? A basement apartment and a mother who couldn't afford milk? You let me believe I was his mother." Sarah's voice was a jagged blade. "You sat at my table. You hugged him. Mark said it was the only way." Chloe wheezed, her hand clutching the thin hospital blanket. "He said you needed to be the one to save him. But now I'm the one who needs saving. Give me the kidneys, Sarah. If I die, the secret dies with me, and you'll never see that boy again. Mark has the real papers. He'll burn them the moment I'm gone." Sarah returned to the house alone, leaving Chloe to the care of the nurses. She found Mark in his office, the safe standing open. He didn't look like a man who had just tried to run his wife off the road. He looked like a man finishing a blueprint. "I did it for you, Sarah," Mark said, his voice a low, booming rumble. "I saw the way you looked at the empty nursery. I saw the hole in your life. I just filled the gap in the infrastructure. You bought a child, Mark. You paid your mistress to disappear, and then you lied to me for 9 years. I gave you a legacy?" Mark shouted, finally losing his cool. "I managed the variables. I made sure you had everything you wanted. And now you're going to go to that hospital, and you're going to give Chloe that kidney. Because if you don't, I'll release the records of the fraudulent adoption myself. I'll tell the authorities you were in on it from the start. You'll lose your license, your freedom, and your son." Subverted beat 3.2. Sarah looked at him, her mind frantically searching for a way out. She remembered the safe. While Mark was distracted by his own tirade, she saw a corner of a document peeking out from a hidden compartment in the back of the steel box. It was a staged private placement agreement. She felt a surge of hope. This was it. A document with his signature. A confession in ink. If she could get this to a judge, she could prove she was a victim of his fraud. She could use this as a lever to secure her rights to Leo. Her legal mind, trained to find the one detail that changed the diagnosis, felt a moment of pure triumph. She reached in and snatched the paper, her heart racing. "I have it, Mark," she said, her voice steady. "The proof of the staged placement. This is my leverage. You won't touch me or Leo again." Mark stopped. He looked at the paper in her hand, and then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. A cold, predatory expression that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "Read the second page, Sarah," he whispered. "Read the clause about transfer of guardianship upon discovery of fraud." Sarah's eyes flew down the page. Her breath caught in her throat. The document wasn't a confession of his crime. It was a fail-safe. The clause stated that in the event the staged placement was ever challenged or revealed as fraudulent, the custody of the child would not revert to the adoptive mother. Instead, due to the illegality of the initial contract, the child would be considered a ward of the state, with immediate preference given to the nearest biological kin, which, in the absence of the mother, was Mark's brother, a man currently serving time in a federal penitentiary for violent assault. "You see, Sarah?" Mark stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. "You don't have leverage. You have a suicide note. If you use that paper, Leo goes to my brother's estate. He'll be in a trailer park in Idaho by morning, and you'll never see him again. That document doesn't prove your motherhood. It proves you have no legal standing whatsoever. You aren't his mother. You aren't his guardian. You're just a woman who's been babysitting my son for a decade. The paper fluttered from Sarah's hand, landing in the dust of the office floor. The triumph was gone, replaced by a crushing, absolute despair. She hadn't found a weapon. She had found the bars of her own cage. She was in a worse position than before she had even opened the safe. She was legally invisible. "You're stressed, Sarah," Mark said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly gentle tone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, pre-filled syringe. "The pressure has compromised your judgment. I'm going to help you. We're going to go to the hospital together, and we're going to finish the design." He lunged for her, his hand grabbing her arm with the strength of a man who spent his life building walls. Sarah fought, her heels skidding on the kitchen tile. The scent of autumn spice was suffocating now, the smell of a rotting home. "Let go of me," she screamed. They tumbled into the kitchen, a violent struggle of limbs and heavy breathing. Mark pinned her against the marble island, the needle hovering inches from her neck. Sarah's hand searched the counter, her fingers brushing against the cold, heavy handle of her grandmother's cast-iron skillet. She didn't think. She swung. The heavy iron connected with the side of Mark's head with a dull, wet clack. He didn't even cry out. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped to the floor, the syringe skittering across the tile. Sarah stood over him, her chest heaving. She looked at the man she had loved, now just a heap of expensive wool and broken lies. She grabbed his belt and dragged him across the floor, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his head hitting the floorboards, the only sound in the house. She shoved him into the basement, slamming the heavy steel door and turning all 3 deadbolts, the ones installed on the inside. She leaned against the door, her forehead resting on the cold metal. But the victory was short-lived. Her phone buzzed. It was James Miller, Chloe's lawyer. "Dr. Jenkins," he said, his voice a sharp, predatory click. "I'm at the hospital. My client has made her wishes clear. If she dies on that table tonight, I have a signed affidavit ready for the police. It details the entire fraudulent adoption. If Chloe Miller doesn't walk out of that hospital with a new kidney, Leo Jenkins will be in state custody by dawn. You have 4 hours, Sarah. Save the mother or lose the son." The hospital chapel was a place of sterile silence, the smell of burnt wax and old hymnals hanging in the air. Sarah sat in the front pew, her hands folded in her lap. She felt like a ghost. She had spent her life fixing others, closing the loops, ensuring the data was perfect. And now she was being asked to perform a miracle of self-destruction. She realized then that Mark had escaped. The basement door had a weakness she hadn't seen, a loose hinge he must have kicked through. He was already at the hospital. She could feel it. He was probably in the administrator's office right now, painting her as a woman who had suffered a nervous breakdown, a surgeon who was no longer fit to hold a scalpel. She stood up. She wasn't a victim. She was a surgeon, and surgeons knew how to cut out the rot. She didn't go to her office. She went to the security room. "Robert," she said, her voice cold and precise. "I need the recording from the kitchen, the one from the hidden device." "You knew?" Wilson asked, his head moving in the Wilson scan. "I'm a doctor, Robert. I notice when the heart rate of a house changes." She took the digital file and a pre-written post-nuptial agreement she had drafted in the back of a taxi. She walked into Chloe's room, where Mark was already standing, his head bandaged, his face a mask of righteous fury. "There she is," Mark said to Dr. Thorne, who stood by the door. "The woman who attacked me. She's unstable, Aris. You can't let her near a patient. Sarah didn't look at Iris. She looked at Mark and Chloe. She pulled out her phone and hit play. Mark's voice filled the room. The confession, the threats, the admission of the staged adoption. It was all there. The structural rot of his legacy laid bare in high-definition audio. This goes to the board, the police, and the press in 5 minutes, Sarah said, her voice a metronome of cold fury. Unless both of you sign this. She threw the papers onto Chloe's lap. It's a total waiver of parental rights, a permanent, irrevocable transfer of guardianship to me. You sign it, I give you the kidney, and I keep my mouth shut. You don't sign it. Chloe dies tonight, and Mark, you go to prison for human trafficking and assault. Choose your exit. The silence in the room was absolute. Mark looked at the phone, then at Sarah. He saw the walls up in her eyes. He saw a woman who was no longer checking her ledger of guilt. He picked up the pen. The surgery was a blur of blue drapes and the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator. Sarah lay on the table, the cool air of the OR biting into her skin. She watched the lights above her, the same lights she had worked under for 1,000 hours. As the anesthesia began to pull her under, she didn't think about the betrayal. She didn't think about the man in the basement or the woman who had sold her son. She thought about the scar she was about to receive. It wouldn't be a mark of shame. It would be a badge of sovereignty. She was paying the final ransom. She woke in recovery to the smell of bleach and the sound of a steady, rhythmic heart monitor. Dr. Thorne was there, his face softer than she had ever seen it. The transplant was a success, Sarah, he whispered. Chloe is stable. And the papers? They're already being processed by the court. Robert Wilson saw to it. Mark tried to enter the room an hour later, his face twisted into a mask of faux concern. Sarah didn't even look at him. Entry 4115, she said, her voice thin but as sharp as a scalpel. I am sorry, Mark, but there is no longer a place for you in this infrastructure. Get out. If you ever come near Leo again, the recording goes to the DA. You're a guest in my life, and your stay is over. Months later, the Pacific Northwest sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long golden shadows across a park overlooking the Sound. The air smelled of salt and pine, a clean, honest scent. Sarah sat on a bench, her hand resting on the slight pull of the scar beneath her sweater. She watched Leo. He was at the top of the slide, his small voice carrying on the wind. 12, 13, 14. He slid down, his laughter a bright, clear sound that cut through the mocking caw of the crows in the fir trees. He ran toward her, his face flushed with joy. Mommy, did you see? I did it without holding on. Sarah pulled him into her arms, the scent of green apples and sunshine filling her world. She realized then that motherhood wasn't a biological fact or a legal filing. It wasn't a staged production or a structural legacy. It was the fire she had walked through. It was the ransom she had paid. It was the simple, beautiful truth of a child who knew exactly who his mother was. She looked out at the water, the Space Needle finally visible through the clearing fog. She wasn't a fixer anymore. She was just a mother. And for the first time in her life, she didn't have an apology to log. The ledger was closed. The loop was finally, perfectly complete.